This is the only video you need when it comes to fantasy football defenses for the rest of the season coming into the end of the year. First, I'll start by going over my top streaming defenses for week 14. Then I'll go into the very important list of stash defenses we can get on our waiver wire that have an amazing fantasy football playoff schedule that are available in all of your leagues. And then finish out the video with my total week 14 rankings. That way we don't skip a beat, we don't miss over anything regardless of what your league size is. If you do appreciate that, go down and hit that like button. It helps me out a ton as a creator. But the first streamer defense this week is going to be the Saints getting a matchup against the New York Giants. Regardless of what quarterback they end up putting out there, if my guess is here, it's going to be Drew Lock, but it doesn't matter. They're all not good. Drew Lock in his first start finished with 178 passing yards and an interception last week compared to DeVito in week 12, who put up 189 passing yards with no touchdowns against a more positive Buccaneers defense, all things considered. Regardless, again, of who this quarterback is, the offensive line is not great. They are dealing with a bunch of injuries. The quarterbacks for the Giants combined from the entirety of the season have one of the lowest time to pass ratings in the entire NFL. That definitely is not going to help your offense, but force a lot more turnovers and probably bad decisions from whoever this quarterback ends up being. As far as the Saints, they allowed 21 points and 3 touchdowns to the Rams last week. If we're being completely honest, that Rams offense is in a completely different universe than the Giants. They had them down to 14 points before that game-winning touchdown, so they looked a little better than the box score showed, but the Saints defense isn't necessarily the strongest internally, but they do play some very, very easy matchups here, and they have a good turnover differential. And whether you like it or not, in fantasy football defenses, takeaways and turnovers are a lot more fantasy points than keeping games low scoring, and the probability of teams staying under 10-15 points isn't very high, so you want to be going for those turnover prone matchups, and that is one. The second defense, though, we need to be streaming this week is going to come in the Titans matchup, which face the Jacksonville Jaguars, another matchup with quarterback trouble. But you look last week, you might think otherwise about this defense for getting blown out against the Commanders. They were down 28-7 at halftime, ended up losing 42-19. By all means, a terrible showing for them last week. But again, that Commanders offense is in a complete different universe than the one that we have with Jacksonville, especially now that we're probably not going to have Trevor Lawrence starting in this lineup. That means we have to go ahead and look at Mac Jones, his starts, and his numbers to see what we're going to get for this matchup. He hasn't necessarily been amazing. His pass volume over the 3 starts that he has played for the Jacksonville Jaguars is not good. He's averaging 27 passing attempts and 161 passing yards a game, totaling 2 touchdowns and 3 interceptions in that stretch. Yes, the Titans are not elite as far as the internal defensive unit at all, but they're getting a matchup with a turnover-prone quarterback that does have some upside. As far as Mac Jones goes, he doesn't have the best weapons in the world. He's relying on Brian Thomas Jr. and Evan Ingram to get this done for him. They're decent, but by no means are they Justin Jeffersons and George Kittles on that offense. So the Titans are a more vulnerable defense, especially in the ground game isolated. You look at ETN and Tank Bigsby, they're kind of underperforming as far as their efficiency goes over the past second half of the season, but it's not like they're facing a Saquon Barkley, so those strengths to weaknesses do match up pretty well, and this is one of the lower projected game totals of the week, so that is also going to keep the ceiling as far as points scored lower for us. That's also a plus. But looking at a defense that is rostered in a bit higher percentage of leagues for us, but still available and need to be rostered if you do have them out there, is going to be the Eagles against the Carolina Panthers. If you watched some of these videos earlier in the week, you know that I've been talking about the Carolina Panthers offense, saying they're looking a little bit better as of late, and it is a statistical fact. They're averaging 21.4 passing attempts over their last 5 games. Bryce Young's pass volume has also increased slightly because of that. But you look at this Eagles defense, we are talking about honestly one of the best defenses as of late. They are top 5 in points given up to opposing offenses. They're also 8th in sacks per game and 3rd in total yards allowed to opposing offenses. Their secondary has been their problem all year, but they specifically are locking in as of late and have really been a bright side of this defense. The Panthers, they don't have the highest prestige of receiving options when you look at the other side of that defensive matchup. Adam Thielen, Xavier Legette, and David Moore are the top 3 wide receivers getting playing time in this offense. They're good, but again, by no means are they Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra, Jamar Chase level of guys. If they are available for you, I would strongly consider grabbing the Eagles defense, and they have some decent matchups coming in the fantasy playoffs as well. Bryce Young still is averaging about an interception a game, so that turnover percentage is going to be there. But looking into another defense here, rostered in a bit over 50% of leagues, but still needs to be a top option for you, is the Buccaneers defense. They get a matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders, who I've had this defense in stash videos for the longest time, so they still might be out there for you. If you haven't gotten your hands on them though, now is your chance to do it. Aiden O'Connell has actually looked pretty decent as of late. He almost beat the Chiefs last week, putting up over 300 passing yards and 2 touchdowns, but we have to remember this team and Aiden O'Connell is still extremely volatile. You don't need an elite defense to perform against this offense here. They let Bryce Young see some success last week. That's not necessarily a plus, but the defense is still posting respectable numbers. They are top 10 in sacks per game, and they're averaging about a turnover forced a game, so It's a decent matchup. You want to be hunting for these turnovers. This is one where you can get that. But we can be looking into the Miami Dolphins, who get a matchup against the New York Jets this week. Who knows what's going on in that offense? Your first initial reaction to this take will probably be, this defense is chalked, Avery. What are we talking about? They're atrocious. They allowed 30 points to the Packers last week. They can't play in the cold. They fell apart. They had, over 20 missed tackles last week. No interceptions, no forced fumbles, no turnovers. It was like you can't get any worse than what we saw last week from the Miami Dolphins. But the NFL is all about making adjustments, and they do come back into the warmth of the Miami air this week in a divisional matchup against the Jets. And the Dolphins do still have something to play for. They have the possibility of making the playoffs. More than likely they won't, but this pass defense is one of the better ones in the NFL. Their run defense is where they typically get torched. We look at Breece Hall. He has been underperforming as of late, whether it's a him issue, it's a scheme issue, it's a coaching issue. Who knows? He is dealing with a knee injury as well. It's not like that's going to help him. And Aaron Rodgers hasn't necessarily looked amazing as of late. This defense is going to carry some risk because of who they are, but there are so many top teams on bye right now that you need to get any bit of light that you can hold on to. So moving into the second part of this video, though, about the defenses we need to be stashing for the fantasy football playoffs, there are actually a lot of defenses out there that have really good schedules that we can get on our waiver wire right now. We're going to be starting with my defenses that are rostered in a lower percentage of leagues and then go higher as the video goes on. If you're in a smaller league or whatever the case may be, we're accommodating for everyone. Just be aware that this isn't my 1 through 5 rankings. It's just the rankings of how the roster percentage goes. But the first one here is going to be the Arizona Cardinals. I love all of these defenses. Don't get it messed up. This defense has started off the year pretty terrible. If we're being completely honest, they have one of the worst secondaries in the NFL. They couldn't stop anybody, but they 100% turn that around. As of late, they have been amazing. They're top 10 in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, quarterbacks, and tight ends as far as restricting their points. Over the last month, they are top 5 in sacks and quarterback pressure rate, and they're averaging about 2 turnovers forced per game. Now they're coming into a matchup against the Seahawks, who average the 5th most passing attempts per game, so the strengths do match up there, but the reason they are a stash is because they get a very positive rest of season schedule for fantasy football playoffs. They get the Patriots, then the Panthers, then a tougher one against the Rams in the fantasy football championship game. If they do continue to keep this intensity up and pressure, which is honestly probably not going to change, because you look at this team, they're second in the NFC West and they have a lot of season left to play. They could very well make the playoffs or at least make a case for a wild card spot, so that is going to give them a little bit of extra juice. And you look at teams statistically that are in the playoff hunt or close to it compared to teams that are way out of it, like the Jets defense. The Jets are really good, but they're nowhere near in the playoff picture. The defenses actually have a very big advantage because these are real people. These are real humans we're talking about. When you're in the playoff push, still pushing in there, you have a lot more incentive to play football, put on for the coaches, put on for your people. But I'm also loving the Colts defense to be stashing. This isn't an urgent one by any means because they are coming into their bye week in week 14, and then they get a tougher matchup against the Broncos in week 15. But keep your eye on them because after those 2 weeks, they get a matchup against the Tennessee Titans, the Giants in those last 2 fantasy football matchups. So that is absolutely amazing. Those are positive league-winning defensive matchups. And again, this isn't a defense that has a super strong internal unit. They're definitely a bit more on the risky side, but you want to be hunting for those matchups with turnovers. Will Levis and whoever the Giants quarterback is at that time are pretty much some of the best quarterbacks in the league at doing just that. So they are also still technically in playoff contention at 6-7, second in their division. So they have something to play for, another incentive to go ahead and add them for your fantasy football playoffs. But my favorite defense, one that I do not understand how nobody is talking about, and I do not understand how they're rostered in less than 40% of leagues, is the Packers defense. This team is top 10 in points allowed to opposing offenses, yards allowed, and interceptions forced, sitting at the defense 6 on the year, and they're one of the most talented internal defensive units with a pretty good coaching staff behind them. They're averaging 3.5 sacks and 2 turnovers forced per game since their bye week in week 10, and have a positive playoff schedule, most importantly coming up against the Lions. We don't want to be starting them in that lineup. That's one of the most negative, which is why the roster percentage is still probably sitting this low. But then after that, they do get some positive ones against the Seahawks, the Saints, and the Vikings to finish out the fantasy football season. You look at all those matchups, they're pretty competitive. Like, those aren't bad offenses by any means. But Geno Smith, Derek Carr, and Sam Darnold are all averaging about an interception a game. You want to be hunting for those turnovers. But more importantly, they do play pretty good at home, and we're entering that second half of the season where it does get really, really cold. They play amazing in cold weather games. We just saw what they did against the Dolphins last week. But moving into my total defensive rankings of week 14, this is going to cover all of the bases for you of my top and my least favorite defenses. The Steelers and the Eagles are going to be in the S tier here. They, number 1, have amazing internal units, and number 2, have really, really good top 3 matchups of the week. This is the best storm we could possibly have. keep in mind, the Eagles aren't rostered in a ton of leagues yet, so you can still possibly get them. In the A tier, this is filled with defenses that have pretty good matchups, a little bit worse of internal defensive units, but still positive. In the C tier, we get a little bit more of those red flags starting to be introduced. Still serviceable depending on what league you are in. We have a ton of top defenses on bye this week, so these could be serviceable. And then in the D tier and on into the F tier, we don't want to be starting these defenses. If you have to, you can, but they're definitely not our top pickings here. That is going to finish off this video though. Thank you guys so much for watching. All glory to the man above, and I will see you in the next one coming tomorrow.